This is a reply to Atheist Paladin, just continuing our discussion from where we left off. The point of disagreement is this. Atheist Paladin maintains that giving tax cuts to the wealthy allows them to create businesses, which by extension creates jobs and leads to economic growth. Whereas my position is that only demand can cause job creation. So, this is a pretty straightforward case of supply-side economics versus demand-side economics. So what follows are the arguments and evidence to support my position. This is probably of limited interest, so I'm just going to do the one video and then let Atheist Paladin respond in support of his position. The first problem with supply side is simply that there is no motivation for the wealthy to create jobs. They tend to invest in passive investments and may put it in something speculative. If a wealthy person doesn't want to start a business, he's not going to start one no matter how much money he has. If a wealthy person wants to start a business, he starts one. He doesn't have to wait for a tax cut. If he's wealthy, he already has the money plus more that he's invested in other things. Let's say a wealthy person wants to start a business. He's not going to just start it regardless of demand. It's hard to sell if not many people are buying. The supply side theory states that this is overcome with a very low price, which will later go up as demand increases. There isn't really much motivation to sell it at a price low enough to stimulate demand, though, so this really isn't going to get you out of a recession. If anything, they invest in short selling all the stock they think is going to take the biggest dive. As you can see from this chart, productivity is climbing while wages remain flat. This next one compares the income brackets. As you can see, only the top really seems to go up. According to supply side, we should have seen steep increases in jobs, following closely with the top 1% income. It really didn't do that, though. You would get back the jobs you lost on the recovery, but that's about it. Unemployment only dipped below 5% for a few years in the later 90s. However, if you include the construction frenzy at the height of the housing bubble, we got under it briefly before the big crash hit. If you look at the mid-40s through mid-70s, you will see unemployment under 5% quite a lot. That was during a time when, theoretically, the wealthy would have been stifled from creating jobs because of much higher taxes. You also have to keep in mind wages were much higher then. There are some coping mechanisms that allowed the economy to keep bouncing back from recessions. The first was the social change, where more and more women joined the workforce from the late 70s through the early 90s. You also have the first major increases in deficit spending going on in the 80s. You can see in the chart that not only did Reagan really start putting supply side into practice, he also started steeply increasing deficit spending. Now, granted, in the beginning of his presidency there was a recession, so this makes perfect sense. Pretty much everyone agrees that this is a very good way to stimulate the economy. However, you really should balance the budget afterwards, but that never really happened. As we saw earlier, for the most part, people's wages remain very flat the whole time from the mid-70s to date. However, in the 90s, people started using a new coping mechanism. People just generally started working more. They would put in more hours or even get a second job. The blue line in this chart is the hours worked. Then, as you would expect from flat wages, the wages go along with it for the most part. As you can see, under Clinton, we were able to have an economic boom and reverse deficit spending, and even get a surplus at one point. Now, if you remember, the argument for the Bush tax cuts was that since there is a surplus, the government is taking too much, so they need to give it back. You would think that would mean the government should take it back when running high deficits. That didn't happen, though. To help get us out of the tech bubble recession, people turned to the last thing they had to cope with having a smaller and smaller piece of the economic pie. That was borrowing, in the form of both credit cards and using their home like an ATM. This infusion of cash kept the economy moving. Then, just when we had almost recovered to where we were prior to the tech bubble, the housing bubble burst. We are having trouble getting anywhere after that because not only do consumers have no way to spend enough to get the economy moving, but they are trying to pay off their debts too. The stimulus bills were too little, too late. They mostly went to businesses anyway. In that political climate, nothing made it through the Senate without being completely neutered to the point of uselessness. So, prior to supply-side policy, we were doing pretty well from an economic standpoint. We also did well in the 90s. However, when we use supply side, we end up with deficits spiraling out of control, the wealthy doing extremely well, and everyone else barely holding on. So, I think the evidence is pretty clear which policy works and which has been a disaster, at least in terms of the majority of the population. Comparing the Reagan, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr. years to the Clinton years is very telling. Only Clinton reduced deficit spending while having an economic boom, whereas the other three seem to rely heavily on deficit spending for the most part. So, we can see the logical flaws as well as the empirical evidence showing that supply side fails while doing otherwise works much better.